Between now and 2, we're going to talk about male circumcision. An estimated 8.5% of men in the UK are circumcised. The vast majority are Jewish or Muslim, where circumcision is nearly universal. In the US, it's the norm, with more than 3/4 of men having undergone the procedure, usually as babies. But in both the Netherlands and Denmark, the National Medical Associations say circumcision is a breach of a child's human rights. So, with that in mind, meet Tom Rosenthal. He's a comedian and he's taking over the first hour of the show. Tom, good afternoon.
Hello, mate.
Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks ever so much for having me, and I'm sorry for making this the topic.
I love the fact that this is a topic, and this is what I love about it so much, because you know when the world is looking in one direction, this show loves going in a completely opposite direction.
Yeah, but it is ultimately lunchtime, isn't it? And everyone's sitting down, eating sandwiches or whatever. Let's have a think about penises.
Exactly. Well, why not? Why not, indeed? It's an important part of our lives.
That's how I feel.
Now, this is, of course, an important subject to you personally because, of course, this has been visited upon your penis, hasn't it?
Sure, yeah. That's a very kind way of putting it.
Yes.
But after 6 days of my life, someone decided to lop a bit of my body off without me having much say in the matter, really.
Was this a joint decision by both your parents?
Yeah, sure. Right. I do sort of want to stress right from the top that it's not necessarily an issue that I have with my parents. It's much more an issue with a culture that allows them to make that decision, because I have a great relationship with my parents and I don't want to dig them out on radio. But they both sort of seem to come to the conclusion that this would be the best thing to do to the end of my penis, and I've sort of grown up to think that I wasn't really on.
Did you grow up in a particularly religious household?
No, not at all.
Right.
I was essentially a-religious, and despite my sort of surname and visage, I have a big nose, if you're listening on the radio. I don't identify as a sort of Jewish person. I wasn't really raised Jewish. I didn't have a bar mitzvah. So, yeah, it does seem to be quite a bizarre cultural artefact that has been foisted upon my genitalia without me sort of necessarily wanting that.
Okay, so let's talk about a conversation you had with your parents when you were 12, and absolutely in mind, we're not digging out your parents on national radio, but you did confront your mum about this when you were 12, didn't you?
Yeah, I mean, I think when people who are in my position, as in when they realise what has happened to them, there is a certain subsection of circumcised men who do get very angry. And I think as an adolescent, when you're first learning about sex, you're first developing your sexual identity, obviously the targets of your rage are your parents. I mean, that's everyone had an adolescent revolt, and I suppose this was mine. However, what I would say is that I haven't necessarily grown out of it, because I've spent my entire life searching for a reason why this was done to me, and it seems to be that there is no good logical one to be had. So whilst the initial target of my anger was my parents, who indeed were given this decision, I now sort of much more take it out towards society, and I kind of ask the question why parents are allowed to make this decision, because I desperately searched for sort of a medical reason why it was beneficial. I heard the arguments that it was somehow aesthetically preferable. Indeed, there's some sort of like religious impediments. They didn't really mean much to me. I just feel like privately, this is a very important part of my body that's been taken off me. And the more that I researched it, the more I found out about the functions of the foreskin, what it actually does during sex. I guess I feel like I've been denied an aspect of my sexual identity that I resent. And I feel like if laws are in place to protect us from each other, like I wasn't necessarily protected in this regard.
I mean, you've even based your latest stand-up show around this. It's called Manhood.
Yeah.
Here's a clip of you performing at the Soho Theatre.
I find it very hard to describe how it feels to be circumcised. I was circumcised after 6 days. Didn't even have a whip with the guy, right? And I just find it really hard to explain how it feels to me. The only feeling I think it's like in life is, you know, when you go to a concert or a sports event and you buy a bottle of soft drink, and then when they serve it to you, without warning, they get the top and they chuck it in the bin. And go, there you go, mate. And you're just like, hey, I would have quite liked that bottle top. I think we both know that performs a function. I would have quite liked to have been consulted before that decision was taken, because frankly it's going to affect me more than you. After all, it's going to get Fanta down his leg and Mr. Brightside comes on. I would have quite liked to have been consulted before that decision was taken.
What an awful voice I have. I'm so sorry that that's been broadcast on national radio. That is indeed a reference lost on people who don't go to concerts as well, so sorry if you didn't find that joke at all funny.
I know exactly that joke. You're right. Tom, you've got a question for us. What is that question?
I guess it is broadly, should parents be allowed to decide whether their children are circumcised?
So, if you are a circumcised man, I would like to know your thoughts on this. Should it be up to a parent whether their child is circumcised? 08085 909 693. And you can text us on 85058. In a moment, we'll bring in a medical ethics expert and a representative of Milah UK. Now, this is a campaign group set up by the Jewish community to promote the rights of Jews to carry out circumcisions. I mean, speaking to your parents about it, what did they say?
Well, without wanting to really reveal too much on the radio as such, they gave numerous reasons. Essentially, my mother had an aesthetic preference, I think, and had perhaps had a sort of bad experience with a man who hadn't had the procedure done to him.
Right. Okay.
Again, it's lunch. Oh, my God, horrible.
Yeah.
And ultimately... she also had a parenting textbook that said that I should be the same as my dad to prevent any sort of psychological damage growing up, thinking I was different from him, which that worked an absolute treat. Broadly, the actual answer is they didn't think about it that much. I think when you're a new parent, I'm an only child, as their first one, you get foisted with lots of advice very, very quickly, and I think you just feel very overwhelmed. And they thought this is something that had happened to my dad. He'd never had an issue with it. They just basically deferred to authority. And I think this is like the key point. Most people in our country aren't going to research the functions of this body part like I have, because I'm an obsessive weirdo. Most parents need guidance, and unfortunately, from my perspective, the guidance that the GMC, General Medical Council, or the British Medical Association give off is very much, make your own mind up. And I think as medical authorities, they actually need to be teaching parents that this is harmful to your child. It goes through obvious pain. You're cutting off healthy tissue. There is no therapeutic reason to do this. All medical associations across the world, apart from one, the American Association of Pediatrics, criticised it, and they say that there is no medical benefit to doing this. So you can't put your child through something that is obviously a horrible thing for a baby to go through, removing healthy tissue, cutting a bit of an intimate part of their body off for no reason. And I feel like if my parents had had the information that is at my hands and that I'm hoping to disseminate via comedy, that hopefully, they wouldn't have made that decision.
Did you have friends who would perhaps self-identify as practicing Jews who, because of the religious justification, would feel more comfortable having it done?
Absolutely, yeah. Right. I have quite a lot of circumcised friends, and none of them have expressed dissent to the level that I have. Right. I would say that some of them have expressed some dissent. They're not like all cool with it, especially when you go into the ways that it affects sexual function and the sort of certain studies that suggest that it is negatively impacts on both the male and the female partner during sex, that then people get like, I'm worried about that. Also, just the sort of logical necessity of losing sensory tissue means that you're going to lose some kind of sexual sensation, which again is quite annoying for some men, I think. But I've got a Jewish friend, and I think watching my show was very difficult for him because he feels the weight of thousands of years of ancestors. I think his parents think that it's something that he should definitely do to his child, but his fiancée is a Gentile and is firmly against it. And I think it's obviously an issue for every generation. It's something that has been around for a long, long time.
Do you find that amongst your generation from the Jewish community that it is something that is now beginning to be questioned more? Or it depends, I guess, on how, as I said you were before, how self-identifying someone is as being Jewish?
To be fair, I mean, I don't claim to hang around in the most Jewish communities. I know two Jewish families, and both of them have
being your own.
To be fair, it's a real question mark whether my family is Jewish. But yeah, no, right. I know, because my mother's not. technically. So my dad also, his mother wasn't really, but we just have a kind of the name and the lineage.
Right.
And I don't know. It's a sticky situation.
Yeah.
But I do know of Jewish families who have chosen the, I think it's called the Bris Shalom, which is basically the ceremony where you form a covenant with God, but with no actual genital cutting. So they basically are Jews who haven't circumcised their boys. And I think that is a growing group. And that is what I'm really hoping to promote, because the circumcision is only going to stop from within those communities that practice it. The question is, it's difficult when I say should they be allowed, because I don't necessarily advocate for a law tomorrow banning male circumcision. I think that would be really not very useful, because that would demonize the cultures that practice it. And these cultures do it out of love. They circumcise their babies because they want to prevent them having to be circumcised when they're teenagers or adults, which they deem to be a worse situation. Like people do it to their babies out of kindness.
Or just out of culture and repetition.
Yeah. Well, 80% of fathers who are circumcised their sons.
Right. So it's
which
just
I think is
repetition.
That's a key indicator of the fact that people don't necessarily ask themselves these questions, and there is obviously a human propensity to tell ourselves stories, and we don't really want to think of ourselves as victims. I think a lot of guys aren't really willing to comprehend the idea that they've been denied something that is important to them or that is key to their sexual function or sexuality. So they much rather say, "Well, it happened to me, and I'm fine, and it's going to happen to my son, and he'll be fine." The truth is that there is a subsection of circumcised men who are not fine. Like, it is damaging in ways that you don't necessarily hear in the mainstream that often. People, suffer depression. There was a recent case of a boy who committed suicide after being circumcised. And I say there is a significant proportion of circumcised men who are upset about it. And you won't really necessarily hear these voices from within these cultures because it's such a suppressed point of view. It's what happens to everyone, and if you've got a problem with it, that's your problem. Whereas I personally believe the case from human rights, the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, suggests that everyone has an inviolable right to their own body. And until someone is old enough to make a choice on what gets cut off them, nothing should be cut off them.
Okay. Get in contact with us, tell us your thoughts. 08085 909 693. You've heard Tom eloquently describe how he feels about this and whether it should be up to a parent whether their child is circumcised or not. You can email Nihal at bbc.co.uk. Let's bring in now Professor David Katz, who is co-chair of MilahUK UK. Good afternoon, Professor Katz.
Good afternoon.
And Tom is there with you, so it's good that you guys can have a conversation about this. Look, Tom has spoke at length about his issues with this. Firstly, let's define, what is MilahUK?
MilahUK is an organisation within the Jewish community which was created to defend the right of the Jewish community to exercise their religious freedom, which is in order to perform what we call Milah. I think one has to define what we're defending to a certain extent, because what we're talking about is non-therapeutic male circumcision for social, religious and cultural reasons performed in the neonatal period. It's not all circumcision. It's a specific type of circumcision which has been part of our tradition. So MilahUK defends that, and in order to defend it, of course, we're mindful of the fact that it must be done as safely as possible by people who are trained to do it properly, and it must be done, and we must actually have organizations that organize that, and so we have close communication with the Initiation Society, which is the oldest Jewish organization, in fact, of any kind in the country, and also with the Association of Reform and Liberal Moelim, who operate for other parts of the community, and we also have close contact with the four main observant traditions in the country: the United Synagogue, which is led by the Chief Rabbi, Spanish and Portuguese, Federation and Union of Orthodox, and then we also liaise and talk to the Union of Liberal and Professional progressive synagogues and Reform Judaism and the Masorti community. So we talk to all parts of the community, and we try and make sure that this form of Milah is done in the best possible standards, and that we continue to be allowed to do this as we have been since Jews were readmitted to the country in the 1650s.
What is the original reason for circumcision, Professor Katz, from a social, cultural and religious perspective, specifically to the Jewish community?
Well, it originates, as in religious position. It originates from the biblical description of Abraham and his circumcision of his sons, both Ishmael and Isaac, and then also from Moses taking that up and saying that it's necessary to be circumcised.
For what reason?
And the reason is because this is a sign of a covenant between the Jewish community, or sign of covenant between the individual Jew and his community and God. That is the underlying reason why Jews circumcise, and
Sorry, Professor Katz, but what if then Jewish people who self-identify as practicing Jews decide that they do not wish to circumcise their male son? Does that make them any less Jewish?
That's a question that you have to go to the individual case. You have to go to that person would have to go to a rabbinic decisor, and that person would get a decision from that rabbinic decisor whether or not.
So that can depend on the circumstance. So there may be medical circumstances, for instance.
Absolutely.
But what if it was Tom's argument? And I understand Tom is right next to you, so Tom could put that argument to himself. But whether it's about actually a right to choose.
The right to choose is the parental right to choose, and the parents make the decision because the child is 8 days old and doesn't have the capacity to make that decision,
no.
And they make
but
that decision.
Can it not be wait until the child is conscious enough to make that decision for themselves?
Well, the reason for doing that is that this is the way it was done to Isaac. This is the tradition that had been brought up in, and it's an introduction into the Jewish community, into the Jewish way of life at the earliest possible opportunity for these boys.
So
I have a great deal of sympathy for Tom's position, because I can understand that for him this was the wrong decision. It was clearly the wrong decision because this is the way he feels about it. But for the vast majority of Jewish boys, and for Muslim boys as well, this appears to have been the right decision because they don't have the same views as he has.
Tom?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I suppose I might quibble with the use of the word vast, but I'm largely in agreement with everything David's said. I just feel like what we have now in our modern value set is a concept of human rights. And the right in the Convention of the Rights of the Child, it's all about having an inviolable right to your own body. And that cannot be obstructed by anyone. It doesn't matter if they're your parents. A parent has no right to chop off any other bit of a child, and it depends if you are going to side on the side of every person having an individual right or a sort of right for parents to say, to inscribe what religion their child is going to be on their child. I mean, the argument of freedom of religion is that this is what Jewish people need in order to express their religious freedom. You're not expressing the religious freedom of the child. The child then subsequently has no choice that they are going to be engraved with this artifact of your religion. And I guess that's what it comes down to. That's where the question is. And I personally feel that human rights are for everyone, and that the answer is no. A parent shouldn't be allowed to irreversibly take healthy tissue off a child because of their own religious beliefs. I mean, frequently people are raised to be Christians and then become atheists as adults. Frequently they are raised to like football and then hate football as an adult. And that's how it should be. You should be able to divine who you are as an adult.
That's Arsenal fans for you.
Yeah, my dad tried to make me support QPR. No, screw that. I'm going to be an Arsenal fan. But in this one case, and it just requires such an odd level of cognitive dissonance to say that this body part is okay to be removed, whereas in any other context, if someone was to invent circumcision tomorrow and go, we're going to do this to a baby, we're going to cut off a bit of its tissue, everyone would just be like, no, of course not. That is an assault. You can't, if I go and, I don't know if you've got a foreskin, but if I go up to you and I chop your foreskin off, that's a crime, right? Why, if you're 8 days old, does it make any difference?
Okay. I mean, Professor Katz, you must have heard these arguments many times before. So what is your pushback to them?
Well, the pushback to them, first of all, I want to say that, you share with the current chief rabbi, are you both fans of Tottenham Hotspur, aren't you?
No, I'm an Arsenal fan.
I'm a Tottenham Hotspur fan.
Oh, right, sorry, yeah.
Exactly.
May I congratulate the chief rabbi?
Actually,
May I congratulate the chief rabbi on his great choice?
Chief rabbi. So both of you share this, share fans.
But
of
I wouldn't get
Tottenham Hotspur.
circumcised for being a Spurs fan.
Exactly. That's
No.
exactly my point.
Yeah.
That's exactly my point. You wouldn't get circumcised because you share.
Well, it's
one
not a
particular-
requirement to be a Spurs fan.
We won't go there. There is an argument that you share your Spurs fandom, but you don't share other aspects of your life, and
Right.
exactly the same thing applies over here. That Jews want to be able to be share parts of their lives in other ways, but this is a particular part of life that's different to them. Now, Tom has raised the question of consent. And he's raised the question of, you need to actually consent. And it's one of the interesting things in the medical kind of ethics climate. Yes, that's the climate of today. But it's actually a very recent aspect of the climate. It only arose, in fact, as a result of experiences of Jews during the 1933 to 1945 period. So when we say the child should have its right to consent, actually that's a relatively new idea, and it
Doesn't make it any less valid, though, does it?
It is a valid idea.
Yeah.
But
Because, if you look at history in its longest sense, the idea of human rights, a convention on human rights is relatively new, but I'm sure you wouldn't say that it's not relevant.
no, but what I want to follow that with saying is that, of course, there's the human right to have to give consent, and in this instance has to balance it with the human right to this little boy to be circumcised and to be the same as other Jews, and to know that this is done in the same kind of way as it was done for his father, his grandfather, etc., is actually also a right. The cultural right to actually
I don't
be
think you
part
can
of your
describe that as a
system.
right, because some people grow up to resent it, like the right to be the same as everyone else. Well, unfortunately, not everyone wants to be the same as everyone else. A lot of people look at the logic underpinning this stuff rather than the sort of religious, cultural reason. And ultimately, laws and rights are logical. They're not about everyone just doing the same thing. There are discrepancies within our legal system.
We've had some pretty illogical laws over the years. to be fair, Tom.
Okay,
Yeah.
no, but they balance out. Is it
Because
completely
they're
right?
defined by culture. They can be defined by culture and faith.
I totally agree, but over a while, the legal system balances itself out. So we used to criminalise homosexuality, but then there was enough cases where it just felt like love is love, and you can't persecute people on the basis of their sexual preference, just like you can't persecute people on the basis of their gender. There's an Equality Act of 2010 which says you cannot discriminate on the basis of gender. And if a baby is born and it is a girl, it is illegal for them to be cut. If a baby is born and it is perfectly, they're a boy, it's perfectly permissible for them to be cut. That is discrimination on the basis of gender.
A number of people are asking about should we not start referring to this practice as male genital mutilation, or MGM? Society seems to be immune to considering the risks and ramifications of circumcision. Maybe a rebrand, for want of a better word, maybe highlight the issue more. And that's not the only person that has asked to define the difference between FGM which is illegal, and circumcision. And Professor Katz will ask you to answer that question in a moment, but I'll give you a few moments to think about that. It's now 33 minutes past 1. And please, 85058 is the text number. A number of texts are coming in about this, about male circumcision and your attitude towards that, and whether you believe that actually it should be, once a child is conscious enough to make that decision, their decision, and we are talking, of course, not for medical reasons, but social, cultural and religious reasons, whether it should be the child's decision or the parent's decision. Right, 26 minutes to 2. Alison Acton is back with the headlines. Yes, Nihal Arthanayake with Tom Rosenthal, and we are talking about circumcision because 8.5% of men in the UK are circumcised, and the vast majority are Jewish or Muslim. And Tom has a question for you listening today. Hey, Tom.
Yo.
A question.
The question is, should parents be allowed to decide if their child is circumcised?
And we have Professor David Katz with us, who's co-chair of Milah UK. Professor Katz, just before we went to the news, I did ask you this question that many people have texted in and tweeted me on, which is, what is the difference between male circumcision and FGM?
Well, first of all, in answering that question, I just want to have to re-emphasize what I said at the beginning, that the role of MilahUK UK is to be pro-religious freedom and to make sure that what is done safely, properly and satisfactory kind of way. And I added on to that the reason for our wanting to do this is because of the biblical mandate as part of our faith, which has been adopted by social and cultural reasons. Now, if one wants to make that equation, Milah UK doesn't go about making decisions about FGM. Milah UK just looks at the situation with FGM and says, well, there's no, as far as we are aware, there's no kind of biblical mandate. So there's no religious issue that's involved there. So coming under the category, it doesn't come under the issue of religious freedom. It could come under cultural freedom, but not under religious freedom. And so we don't think that for that reason the equation is appropriate. There's nothing about the age or stage at which it should be performed. So that's straight away different. There's an issue about...
But people quite understandably and justifiably find FGM, the idea of it, repugnant, and therefore it is illegal to do it. And people argue culturally, those people who've practiced it for millennia, that it is part of their culture. You're in very dangerous ground, isn't it, when you start to argue that just because this is part of our culture that somehow you should just accept it.
No, I'm not suggesting that at all. Coming on to the next issue, which is this is perceived, and from the point of view of the Jewish community, it's generally perceived as probably a method of controlling women, and of controlling women in a particularly aggressive kind of way. And the comparator with the male is that there isn't this kind of control. There's no attempt to actually interfere with the sexual behavior of men, although we've heard some comments from Tom that might suggest he believes that it does. It's far, far more invasive, and there are lots of evidence about this, and there's lots of also evidence about the dangers.
I just want to jump in. I'm sorry. I want to clarify that I'm not making a complete equivalence between male circumcision and female circumcision, but the argument that it's more invasive is not actually generally true. The majority of FGM is what's called a ritual nick, which is practiced in countries like Indonesia, where like 70% of women are circumcised. It's literally just a little cut in the clitoris, which by any metric removes less tissue than a male circumcision.
I agree that that's what's practiced in Indonesia, but that still leaves us with 100 million people in areas where that isn't the case. There are large parts of the Middle East and of North Africa.
And South Asia, where they don't have female genital mutilation.
Bits of South Asia, they don't have female genital mutilation, I agree, but I also think that there are huge areas, Ethiopia, Sudan, bits of Egypt, where it is widespread. And there are many friends of mine in the Muslim community who've pointed out that, that there's a cultural difference between these, but these cultural differences are pretty large.
Okay, I want to bring Dr. Jonathan Ives in now, who's a reader in empirical bioethics at the Centre for Ethics in Medicine at Bristol University. Dr. Ives, good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Thanks for having me.
You've been listening to Professor Katz and Tom have this conversation, and you've looked into this issue. Is it something that's being viewed as more controversial as time goes on? And I think Professor Katz alluded to that when he was talking about these concepts of human rights, for instance, and the rights of a child.
I think there's certainly growing interest in it. I think historically it's just been accepted as something that is done, and as time goes on, people are starting to question the practice and look for justifications. And I think legitimately saying, is this something we should carry on? And of course, that's how we develop as ethical creatures. We ask a question and we think, is this still justified? And this is exactly the sort of conversation that we need to be having.
So there are various claims and counterclaims, Dr. Ives, about the health risks or medical benefits of circumcision. Where does medicine stand on this?
Well, I'd stress that I'm not a medical expert. First of all, right. I'm an ethicist, but you
would have seen the arguments on either side.
Yes. I mean, the position expressed certainly on NHS choices by the BMA is that there are no health benefits specifically.
Right.
The medical evidence is equivocal. So some studies suggest there are benefits and some suggest there's not. And I think Tom mentioned early on that the only medical association to say that they think the health benefits outweigh the risks is the American Academy of Pediatricians.
And what about hygiene?
Well, I think one argument in favour is that a circumcised penis is more hygienic. But from the conversations and the evidence I've seen and the medical opinion I've looked at, regular washing and good hygiene practices are just as good.
And what about this? I mean, at the heart of what Tom is saying about not having the right to choose. Now, this gets into your territory because this is about the ethics and about consent. And, in terms of the Human Rights Act, where does circumcising a baby stand?
Well, I guess if I could give you a straightforward answer to that question, we'd have resolved it.
Okay.
So, I mean, it's tricky because one of the principles we hold very dear is the principle of respect for autonomy that says that a person should be able to determine the course of their own life, and part of that is a right to bodily integrity, to decide what we do with our own bodies. And of course, we're talking about an infant, a very young child who doesn't have the capacity to make that decision for themselves.
And Nihal, in our country, whenever it's gone to courts, it's only when the two parents disagree. If a mother and a father disagree about whether to circumcise the child, it will go to the UK courts, and UK courts always rule in favour of the child. However, if both the parents agree that this child should be circumcised, the courts get circumvented.
So what does that mean then? Because by ruling in favour of the child, that automatically results in the child not being circumcised.
Yeah, because of the rights that Jonathan's talking about.
Right, okay, because they can't consent.
Well, I mean, when a court makes a decision like that, they're bound by the law to make a decision in what we call the best interests of the child. So the child's welfare is paramount, and I think generally
even as a baby.
Yes.
I mean, obviously their welfare is paramount even as a baby, but I mean, in terms of when it goes to court, is it largely with babies who don't have the power themselves of speech and perhaps consciousness enough to be able to make that decision themselves, or does it sometimes, when it goes to court, it's maybe even secondary school kids? Tom,
as far as I understand, rights actually increase in the case of children. So there's special protections on children, such as labour laws and stuff. So actually, as your age decreases, your rights increase as opposed to decreasing because they're like an idiot baby or whatever.
But if I may say, the argument is that it's the right of the Jewish child, which is the one I'm talking about, but also the Muslim child, to be circumcised, because that's part of the tradition that he's going to grow up in.
What do you make of that, Dr. Ives? Because it's of the culture and religious practices that they grow up in.
Yes.
Well, I think it's a really complex question. I think it's really important.
That's why we're doing it.
Yes, yeah. It's really important to really understand the reasons that kind of undergird these decisions. And I guess the question I might have for Professor Katz, and it's a genuine is, the assumption or the claim is that it's in the child's interests to have this procedure done, and to think, well, these decisions should be made on the basis of what is in the best interests of the child. And Tom is saying, well, it's in the best interest of the child to be able to make that decision for themselves when they are able. And the argument from Professor Katz agrees the child's interests are important, but is saying that it's in the child's interests to have this done now. And my question is,
for religious
why?
and cultural reasons, not medical ones.
Yeah, well, why is it in the interests of the child to have this done now, at this point? Why is it better to do it now rather than to wait until they can choose?
Okay, Professor Katz.
Well, I'm not going to go the medical route, but there is some evidence that the complication rate is much lower if it's done during the neonatal period than at a later stage, and the degree of discomfort and the post-circumcision recovery phase is better. But I mean that's going along the medical route, and I don't want to go along that route. The question is, strikingly, I was once on a General Medical Council panel with another panelist, and we had to discuss issues of discrimination. And this panelist said to me, well, her experience was, her first discovery that she was Jewish was when she went to school when she was 6, and she came home crying and said to her parents, parents asked why she was crying. She said it was because, who is Jesus and when did I kill him? And that's the point to a certain extent, because this is a child that's going to grow up and is going to not only be circumcised. The child is also going to be told somewhere along the line in his early days about Jewish identity in all sorts of different kinds of ways, observing maybe Hanukkah, somebody wearing a skull cap, all those kinds of things. And in some ways I think that's why Tom is so disturbed by this, because it's the only symbol of that identity that he apparently has. If you're growing up with a whole number of symbols of that identity, it's part of a package, it's part of a framework.
So it doesn't matter as much then?
It doesn't matter as much if you know the rabbinic and Talmudic sources of circumcision in a simplified form, but as a very small child, you go to your brother or your cousin's circumcision as a celebration, which one has to remember. That's important.
Sorry, Tom, please.
Yeah, no, I would say that does ignore the people who are coming out from within these communities. There are Jews and Muslims who I've met. You can go to websites called mendocomplain.com, where you see people who were very much brought up within these cultures, who know all that stuff and still reject it. There's a great talk on YouTube by a guy called Eric Klopper, who is, talking about his Jewish identity as the reason this has happened to him. And actually, sometimes they're more angry because it's been justified by their religion, not less.
Well, let's speak to Amjad, who's from the British Muslim community and got in contact with us. Afternoon, Amjad.
Hello. Hello, Nihal.
Now, you are circumcised.
I am.
The majority of your male Muslim friends are, I presume? I'm not sure if you ask them, but...
I don't look down there, but I'm...
Yeah, well, you don't have to look down there. You can just ask them, Amjad, and then you can ask for proof if you wish, but that's up to you.
Well, people don't, to be fair. People don't want to talk about it. They're not as weird as me.
Well, is it a topic of conversation at all, Amjad, with your friends?
No, not really, no. Like I said to your researcher, the first time I actually realised that this had happened to me was at high school in a changing room. I realised that I had something missing, which I was predominantly in a non-BAME school, and I had something missing which the others had, and that's the first time I realised. But I don't want to come across as one of these people who say, just because something happened to me and I'm not conscious of the visible effects it has on me psychologically or physically, that it's done me no harm. But I am actually not aware of any harm that it has done me.
So wait a minute. So when that happened, sorry, Jett, but when that happened, and post rugby or football or whatever, everyone jumps in the showers, etc., can be quite a nerve-wracking experience. Now, if you are different in that respect, was it pointed out to you? Did anyone take the mickey out of you for that?
Yes, I would say so. Yes, I think my school pals, school colleagues, or whatever you want to call them, they did realise that actually he has got something missing. But again, there was a bit of teasing about it. But again, like I said, after a period of time, people got used to it, and no more was said about it.
Okay.
So in that sense, it didn't really leave any sort of psychological impact. I wasn't bullied because of it or anything like that. No.
I would say thank you very much, Amjad, for coming on and talking about your penis. And this is the case with...
I bet you didn't think that was going to happen when you woke up this morning, Amjad.
Loads of people are like this. They're circumcised and they have no issue with it. And I'm happy for them. Like, I'm really glad that that's how you feel about what happened to you. But I guess my point is that there is a subsection that aren't, and they should be protected by law, just like everyone's protected from any other infringement on their individual liberty. Like, it's weird doing this show about it, because I don't want to depress people who are circumcised, but because it happens when it's so young, it's all about the story that you tell yourself. And I suppose I am a personality type that is inquisitive and does want to learn about what they're missing. And actually, when you find out about the intricacies of the body part and its function and the damage that it's done to other people, you kind of do realise that this is a harm, whether Amjad wants to realise it or not.
Right.
Even though I'm very happy that he's happy. I want him to be happy.
Right, good. Amjad, Tom wants you to be happy. That's important.
No, but the thing is, if we take his argument to the logical conclusion, you don't do it as a baby, then you do it when you're a fully formed adult. Surely that could have more of an impact. Even physically, you're likely to feel the pain more when you're or be aware of the pain more when you're older.
Okay.
So and obviously there's possibly a bigger, a larger argument about whether anything can. Where do you draw the line? Can a parent impose any sort of religious instruction or religious value on?
Well, there is a difference between keeping pork out of their diet and taking away a part of their body.
Yeah, because they can grow up and eat bacon.
Yeah, they can do that. Yeah, Amjad, thank you. Jibril is on the line. Jibril, good afternoon to you, sir.
Yeah, good afternoon, sir. How are you? Thank you for having me.
What would you like to say, Jibril?
I'm really interested in this program today because I was driving. I just pulled up. I said, let me just have my say.
Love that.
I am absolutely...
Let's talk about your penis, Jibril.
Yes, I am circumcised, man, absolutely.
Right.
I came from Sierra Leone, you understand? Right. And most of all my brothers, my cousins, everyone in my whole entire family were circumcised. But we never had any complications or anything.
But you also had no choice.
Yeah. No, well, it's like I was a baby when my dad told me when I was about a month old when I had it done. So, but all of us, all my brothers, 5 of us, all of us have this thing done, but we never had any problem. And I believe if you have, because I've been with different women, you understand? If you circumcise men and you rival with us uncircumcised men, you're going to end up taking out women from that man because women love you so much. I must say this.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So are you arguing that you're a better lover because of this, Jibril?
Definitely.
Okay.
Definitely.
All right. Cool. All right.
I met a woman.
No, we don't need to take it any further than there. But thank you, Jibril, because we just I need to get a slide. Jibril, thank you very much. I just want to get a last point from Dr. Jonathan Ives on this, because a number of people are texting in and tweeting in just to say, well, what's the difference between FGM and this? And now, so from an ethical perspective, Dr. Jonathan Ives, have you looked into this?
Well, in the difference between them, which has already been alluded to, is really there's lots of different kinds of FGM or FFGC, or that it's
Yeah, none of them,
Difficult.
thankfully, regarded to be acceptable. Is
No,
there?
well, certainly not in the UK. No, the similarities are that they are traditional cultural practices that people practice because they are felt to be important. I think Professor Katz did point to quite an important distinction, and the reasons they're performed are sometimes different, but it's very difficult to generalise. So these are performed for lots and lots of different
But people look at
reasons.
this and they look at where in the body this is practiced and what is being practiced, and they find it hard to make a distinction when there is so much repugnance around FGM, and rightly so.
Yeah, but the obvious similarity, and perhaps the big ethical similarity, is that you are interfering in taking away healthy tissue
Yes.
from an infant who can't consent. You're not giving them the choice to grow up, the opportunity to grow up and make that choice. So the key ethical similarity is it's an insult to the prospective autonomy of the infant, and they then have to live their life with the consequences of the decision that's made. And I think one of the fundamental things, and one of the things that differentiates this between other kinds of decisions that parents make for their children, which we do all the time, and we think parents have that right, it's the irreversibility of the procedure.
We're going to have to leave it there. Dr. Jonathan Ives, thank you very much indeed. Professor David Katz, thank you to you as well. Tom, last point from you then. This has been fascinating. Thank you for so much for bringing this subject to us.
I'm really happy that Jibril loves his circumcised penis and that all the women that he has sex with are very pleasured. The science may say the opposite, and I think people's individual rights should supersede weird cultural norms about who's good at sex.
And Tom Rosenthal, happy birthday to you, my friend.
Thank you very much.
What a way to spend your birthday.
First for news.